I think what we'll do is we will get started. My name is Deb Canham. I'm a baby lock educator. Everything I'm going to tell you tonight applies to whatever machine you have. It's not specific to one serger. It is going to be serger related, not cover stitch and chain. So we will move on with it. Could you rescue Rosie, Dick? So let us have, first of all, a revision on stitches. Because although I mention stitches quite a lot, I don't always go back and look at them again and really say to you, what do those stitches do? So I've written out the notes, and the notes are in the group. And the first one we're going to think about is 4-thread overlock. Okay, I think probably the most used serger stitch. And I'm sure all of you have used it. It's where you use both your needles, your upper looper and your lower looper. And it is going to give you the most basic, secure stitch. And it's going to be a stitch that stretches. So, what are the best applications for 4-thread overlock? Well, I would definitely say probably the first one that comes to mind is knits. And some people prefer to use 3-thread because they think it's stretchier. But I'm of the school where I like my seams to stay together. So for me, I feel much more secure using a 4-thread overlock when I'm stitching a knit. Okay. But also you're going to use a 4-thread overlock for sewing wovens. And some might say, well, actually, you'd be better off using a 5-thread safety. And that might well be true, but not everybody has 5-thread safety. Remember, you have to have a combo machine to have 5-thread safety. So 4-thread overlock is a great stitch for wovens, for household goods, curtains, cushions, pillowcases. But what other things can we use it for? Well, it's the first stitch you should think of using if you're using your serger stitches for gathering. Okay, you're going to get 2 lines of straight stitch and you can pull those threads up. So you really need that for gathering. Don't use any other stitch unless you have cover stitch, but that's another story. Another time I would think to use 4-thread overlock is if I was sewing in a zipper. Okay, but everything has a but. It would need to be a dress weight zipper because a 4-thread overlock is quite wide. Okay, so if you used a heavy outdoor zipper, or even just some of the zippers that have pulls that come on, they're a little bit wider. And actually, if you use a 4-thread overlock, you're going to sew so tight to the edge with those bigger zippers that your zipper won't open. So when I say 4-thread overlock with a zipper, it's a light dress weight zipper, okay? And of course, we use it for decorative stitching, but actually not as much as I use every other stitch. So that sort of talked about 4-thread overlock. So now we're going to talk about 3-thread overlock wide. So that means we have taken out the right-hand needle. So we only have 1 line of stitching and then the upper looper threads that meet at the edge. So I did say to you earlier, and I'll say it again, I'm not wild about 3-thread overlock wide for knits, unless it's a seam that's not going to get much wear. There's much more safety in 4-thread overlock. And 4-thread overlock stretches sufficiently for a knit, okay? So what else would I use it for? Well, clearly I'm going to use it for things like my robe class the other day. We could have used a 3-thread overlock because it's not a garment that's going to get a lot of wear or pressure on the seams. So a 3-thread overlock would have done us. I think most of us used 4. But also things like cording. So if I'm going to make some cording, put my cording foot on, put the piping underneath, and I'm going to make my cording, I'm going to use a 3-thread overlock wide. If, it's always an if, I'm using a fairly narrow cording. And the reason for that is I'm actually going to sew that piece of cording once, twice, 3 times possibly, and I don't need all that 4-thread on there. It's just extra and it's just not necessary. So I would use a 3-thread wide on a narrow cording. Another time I would definitely use it is if I'm finishing a seam. if I've sewn a garment and I just want to finish the edge of my seam, 3-thread overlock, perfect. Another time I might use 3-thread overlock wide, I'm still on wide, is quilting. Okay, quilting, I only use 3-thread overlock wide. Now I see some people use 4-thread overlock wide. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that when I'm sewing on the sewing machine, I don't sew it twice, so I don't think it's necessary when I'm sewing it on the serger. So I use 3-thread overlock wide when I'm serging pieces together for a quilt. Decorative edge, love 3-thread overlock wide. It's probably one of my favorite stitches to sew around the edge of a garment, not a garment, a placemat or a quilt or anything like that. I might use another stitch, but let's leave it at that. And of course we get lots of decorative stitches with 3-thread overlock wide. We get the Mexican wave, which you see on a lot of my work, and I obviously use my 8 and 12 thread, but I didn't really want to get heavily into decorative threads tonight. So what I want to do is I want to check out the 3-thread overlock narrow, 3-thread overlock narrow hem, and 3-thread overlock rolled hem. So what I'm going to do is I am going to turn you around to my machine because I am threaded up. The first one I'm going to do is a 3-thread overlock narrow. Okay, and then I'm going to come back to you and discuss what we could do with that, and then I'm going to do the next one. So let's turn you around to my machine, and here we are. So of course I sewed a sample first. I have to remind myself I can do it, you see. So here we go. I use decorative threads because it's just easier for you to see, but that orange thread was in the upper looper, and that pretty little blue thread was in the lower looper, and if I look at the back, there's the lower looper stitch, and I just used regular thread in the needle. But what I like about this stitch is it lays very flat, and you'll note that I'm actually using 2 pieces of fabric. Okay, so let me just do that. Let me just check I've got my settings right. So for 3-thread overlock narrow, I'm using the O2 needle, which I am. I'm going to have a stitch width of 3, which I have. I'm going to have a stitch length of 2, and I'm going to have my automatic stitch selector, which you can't see, but I'm going to have it on B Bravo, and that's totally common for a narrow stitch. Okay, and what I'm going to do is lift my foot, put it under the knife, and I'm just going to stitch down this other side. I'm going to raise you a little bit, you can see better then. Okay. And you can see I'm feeding, and I'm not putting much pressure on that piece of fabric, okay? I'm not fighting with it. The feed dogs are better than I am. They know what they want. So, there it is. And, you know, I use this stitch a lot. So let me just turn you around so I can talk about what I use it on. I have to get my list because I won't get it right otherwise. Well, because we use double fabric, remember we use double fabric for this, a narrow hem is a really good finish if you've sewn it on the sewing machine and you just want a nice finish on the edges. Of course, you can do that on single fabric. But this seam is actually very good on double fabric, and this is an occasion, this is the stitch I would use to sew in a heavier weight zip. Okay, a 3-thread narrow with a heavier weight zip won't get close to the teeth. The other time I'm going to use it, do you remember I mentioned cording? If I was using a very thick cording, then I would use a 3-thread narrow to avoid sewing into the actual cording, which can happen if you use a really big one. I would use 3-thread narrow to do things like circles. It's perfect for circles. Much easier to work with a narrower stitch on a circle. Okay, so if I was sewing something circular and perhaps I had to turn it right side out or anything like that, I would use this stitch. And I would use this stitch if I was stitching round the edge to finish it off. I would definitely use this stitch. It's going to give you so much less trouble than a wide stitch. A wide stitch on a circle doesn't have enough room sometimes, and it can be problematic. Another thing I can do with this stitch is I can put wire underneath it to make nice edges to decorative ribbon or fabric, just to wire it and give it a firmer edge. And as I said, decoratively wise, circles, edges, table mats. If you're using a thick thread and you're having trouble, try a narrower stitch. So 3-thread narrow, okay? So I've got something to tell you. Before I go on, I decided I'd have a competition. I've forgotten the piece of paper. Let's have a look. So what I thought I would do is I would give a prize tonight. And the prize is my my day tote. Do you know my day tote? I don't have one down here. I meant to have one down here. It's a smaller bag and it has nice straps on it and prairie points, of course. And I've taught it quite a lot in class. So that is the prize tonight. You get the kit to make it and you get the pattern. Of course, you need the pattern. So what is the question? The question is, there is something new in my workroom, and you have to be really specific. There's something that you've never seen in my workroom before, okay? And you have to name it exactly. And Richard's going to watch all the comments. It was actually a way of getting Richard to really pay attention to the comments, but anyway, you get a prize if you guess it. So start thinking or looking. So that was 3-thread overlock narrow. And what I want to do now is go to 3-thread overlock narrow hem. So what is the difference between those two stitches? Well, there is a difference. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn you around and show you just show you the difference. So I can take you back to the machine because we're going to sew it.
We have a winner already.
Oh, we have a winner already. Oh, well, we'll announce them at the end. We have a winner. Wow.
Yes, we do.
We do. Wow. That was quick. I was really hoping it was going to take you all evening to get there. Right. Okay. So back to this. This one is 3-thread overlock narrow hem. And you think to yourself, well, why is it called a narrow hem? Well, actually, there's a small bit of fabric underneath the looper stitches at the back. It turns over a narrow hem. It then sews right over it, and it's flat-ish. It's pretty flat. Okay, so I'm going to change my settings. Everything remains the same. I just need to change the settings. And I want you to note that I am using a single piece of fabric. Probably with 2 pieces of fabric, it might have trouble turning it up. So I'm using a single piece of fabric. So let's see. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to change my stitch length, which is down here, to 1.5 R. And what that means is whenever you go onto the rolled numbers with the R, it means you're going to get a rolled edge. Well, we discussed it. We said there's going to be a hem. And we're going to have stitch width at 3. And my stitch selector is going to change. It's going to go to C Charlie. Okay. So here we go. Let's have a look and see what happens. Somebody says I need to zoom out slightly. I can do that with the new system. Let's do it. Okay, is that better? Okay, I'm going to sew this edge off. And as I said, single edge because I am turning a hem. And I'm going to lift my foot, put it right under the knife. Needles are high. And I'm going to increase my stitch length to 2 because actually it's quite tight. And you know, if you need to make alterations to this, it will probably be in the stitch length depending on what thread you use. So there you have it. Can you see that? And on the back is the blue looper thread. And as I said to you, there is a hem under there. Okay? So we have turned a small hem. we can still see the looper stitches on the edge. And I just want to remind you, this is narrow hem, okay? So I'm going to turn you around and we're going to discuss what we can use that for. So we can use that for, guess what? A narrow hem. So for sure we can do that. It actually makes a good edge for ruffles. And you know, sometimes with ruffles, if we use the 3-thread narrow, what you have to remember with the 3-thread narrow is it's actually wider. Can you see that? It's actually wider than this stitch. See how much wider it is? Although in fact we didn't really change the width. Okay? So being as it has a narrower edge, it probably won't affect the gather on the ruffle as much as sometimes can happen. Okay? And the other thing we can do with it is we can make wired edges. And this would be a good finish for a lot of hemlines, you know, so that's that. And then the next stitch we're going to talk about is rolled edge, 3-thread rolled edge. So let's go back to the machine and sew it, and I'll show you the stitch. It's easier to show you on the other camera. So this is a rolled edge. And do you see that we're looking at the front of it and we cannot see any of the blue thread that's on the lower looper? But if I turn it over, you can just about see it at the back there. The upper looper thread rolls all the way over to the back, okay? And it's called a rolled edge. And it's great for a lot of finishes, but we'll discuss the finishes in a minute. So let me just double check my numbers. And I have O2 needle, stitch width at 3.5. Well, that's a bit wider than I've used so far. And the stitch length, it says 1.5. 1.5, that'll do. And then the big one, the stitch selector goes to D. And I know it makes no sense, but I always think D stands for rolled hem. It has a D in it, so, you know, that makes it work. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew it. And have you noticed a single piece of fabric? It's not going to roll a thick piece of fabric or a double piece of fabric, okay? And I'm going to increase my stitch size just a bit. I'm using 12 weight threads, so I probably should have made it a bit bigger. There you go, there is a rolled edge. And you're probably thinking to yourself, apart from a couple of little tiny threads sticking up, that covered the edge really well. And the reason for that is it's a 12 weight. Whenever you use a thicker yarn, you're always going to get better coverage on the edge. Okay, so that was a rolled edge. So let's decide what are the best things that we can use a rolled edge for. Well, it's great for hems, just the same as the other one, the narrow hem. And if you're doing something like miles of evening dress hem or a train, and I don't mean the choo-choo type, you know, that is a really good choice, okay? Knit finish, when you're sewing knits, I have one sample of this. I did have a t-shirt, but I haven't found it in ages. Can you see this section here? Whoops. This is a lettuce hem, and what it is a rolled edge, and it's stretched, and it causes these waves, and it makes a really super duper hem on children's wear or adults knitwear t-shirts. But be warned, don't use it on a pattern shirt, because the trouble with pattern shirts, pattern knits, is the back of them are always white. So you get this ugly white and then whatever the pattern is. You always need to do it on a solid knit. So the other thing we can do with rolled, we can make trim and we can make cording. You know, we can, not so much cording, but, well, cord, narrow cord. And we decided last week we could braid it and all sorts of fun things. So there's a way to go with that. It makes a great edge on ribbon. If you want to make a wired ribbon, you're going to sew it into that. And of course, it's great for twiddly woos. Okay, we've got twiddly woos here for just putting thread over wire. Let me find one that you can see better. Thread over wire. That's the stitch you want. So, okay, I think I was going to talk about flat lock, but you know, maybe I wasn't going to talk about flat lock. I think we did flat lock last week. I'm going to talk about flat lock next week because I'm going to include more in it about the other things it does. So that leaves me with any questions, Richard?
Well, we've got the winning answer. Would you use 12 weight on chiffon or maybe bulky nylon?
Yeah, you know, would I use 12 weight on chiffon or bulky nylon? I think I'd use bulky nylon. I think I probably would, unless you wanted a more decorative finish. But you know, woolly nylon gives a nice coverage, and it's generally slippery, slidey fabric that we're working on. So yeah, I think it would be more in keeping with the fabric to use a woolly nylon, perhaps.
Someone asked what weight thread, but in connection with what I don't know.
Somebody asked what weight thread. I'm using 12 weight tonight. It just stands out more when I'm showing you something than using serger thread. But
some lady who tuned in late said, "What is everybody talking about a dress form?"
Okay, well, we need to give the winner of that.
Yes, indeed. Don't keep them waiting any longer, though.
Don't keep them waiting any longer, because I don't want you still looking. Who is it?
It's on your piece of paper.
Oh, it's on my piece of paper. Okay, I hope I pronounced it. Well, Richard, you pronounce it.
It's Mary Catherine Wadus Palu.
Yeah.
Is the winner.
And what it was I have an arm on my dress form. First time ever. I have an arm on my dress form. I have a new dress form, but I always have a dress form. But I have a new arm. I only have one arm, but I have one. Okay, so I just wanted to run through